Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 2021 Student Paper Competition with the ASFPM. We have two great presentations for you today. Just a quick introduction on the Student Paper Competition process. It started late last fall with the submittal of almost 20 abstracts from across the world. Those abstracts were judged and narrowed down to 3 papers. And out of those papers, we have 2 finalists, Equisha Glenn from City College of New York and Vanessa Lee from UC Berkeley. With that, I will turn it over to Equisha and her presentation on seasonal forecasting of coherent floods. Equisha?
Hello, and thank you for having me. What I'm presenting here today is our work on a new framework for detecting floods in the US. And using the Northeast, we're demonstrating the application of this for flood risk management. But before I go into the details of how we derive this method for detecting floods, I want to give some background on the current state of flooding in the US and the motivation for developing this new framework. In the US, floods have become more frequent and intense over the past several decades. Unfortunately, with this, they've also become more deadly, so more people are dying as a result of these extreme floods year to year, especially over the past 10 years. They're also becoming more costly. So there were 9 flooding events that exceeded the billion-dollar mark just between 2016 and 2019, so just within that 3-year period. On top of this, this trend is actually projected to continue. Climate change projections are showing that the US is expected to have more heavy rainfall and severe weather events. So flood risk management is already a priority, but as we're moving into the future, that need is continuing to grow in order to mitigate the impacts, especially of these extreme flooding events. Now, the frequency and distribution of these flooding events does vary across the US. So as you see here, there are some regions that do experience more floods than others. And you see that includes the Northeast, the Southwest, you have Texas, the eastern side of the United States. However, especially within recent years, there have been many more places reporting more floods and more intense floods. So this distribution is changing over time. So how do we currently predict these floods or present flood risk? Some of the most common ways for predicting floods or forecasting floods and risk are shown here. So for example, you have your near-term, short-term scenario, and this is your flood watch, flood warning. You make an alert on your phone or information from your local news station. And this is a forecast that covers the next few hours or the course of a day. Then you have the other end of the spectrum where you have future scenarios. So you have your 20, 30, 50, even 100-year predictions, usually at a county level, where you'll know the risk for a certain location, but way into the future. And then one of the most common types of maps, often the one presented by FEMA, is this flood zone, floodplain map. And this is where, again, normally in a county level, where you'll have a risk for that location, but it's based on a 1 in 100-year flood or 1 in 500-year flood sometimes. But it remains as just a static map of just that location for that type of flood event. However, one gap here with these current methods is, what about the time in between near term and future? Is there some way to have a forecast where you can have information a season ahead of time and year to year? So that way flood managers have some type of actionable information they can use that can prepare them ahead of the season, and resources and other things can be deployed to possibly mitigate some of the risks from these extreme flooding events. So that's just one challenge related to some of these current methods. Now, some other challenges include these maps or these risks or forecasts are produced on an individual basis. So they're usually locally developed and don't take into account maybe some possible regional scale effects that could be influencing flood occurrences in that location. On top of that, you have these individual pieces of information that are then put together or pieced together to then make a regional scale map without actually considering flow and network effects produced by the region as a whole. Commonly, there's also the in or out flood designation. So you can look at maybe a county level map, and one county may reflect, high flood risk here, and the neighboring one may not show that same level of risk, but that's because it's just based on those county boundaries. It may not really reflect what's happening there geographically, because someone near the border of some of those counties could still have a high risk, but it's not being reflected because of the county level information. So what we're aiming to do here, and the motivation, is to be able to bridge the gap between all these individual events and take into account regional scale forecasts. We're aiming to look at these individual events, but collectively. So that's where this new framework comes in for detecting floods. We want to consider, yes, the individual flood events at each location, but we want to look at their collective behavior. How are these stations flooding simultaneously? So that's when we're able to bring it to a regional scale while still retaining the individual location information. So with this, we're interested in classifying floods as simultaneous events within these regions. And with this, we aim to be able to include other variables like climate information to be able to predict or forecast the number of these simultaneous events. And we're classifying these under the Compound Flood Index. Now, the Compound Flood Index, the CFI, is the total number of these simultaneous flood events that you have per season. And this is a data-driven approach, so the data will reveal what this season is for these simultaneous flood events. And then now that will be used as an input for your forecast model or your forecast, paired with climate information to be able to generate this season ahead flood forecast. So we'll be able to use this information year to year to then give a forecast for the upcoming season or year to determine how many of these CFI events you're likely to have. For the Northeast, we used HUC2, designated as HUC2 by the USGS, and we wanted to go back far enough in time to be able to include climate as an input for the forecast. So starting from 1955, we were able to collect 55 stations where we were still able to maintain full coverage of the region, as well as cover that 60-year time span. Each of the stations had at least 85% of their data available. And most importantly, we chose stations that were on unmodified streams. So there were no dams or man-made structures there to influence or control the flow at those locations. Thus, we could explain these changes, again, using climate information. Here I want to give an overview of the Compound Flood Index and illustrate how it works before I go into the details of how to derive it. So for example, let's say you have a season of interest. For you, it's January through March. And typically, we would look at, all right, how many stations flooded during this period individually, right? So at this station, you have 4 floods. Down here, this one has 12. Over here, this one has 9. Now with the CFI, what we're aiming to do is see how many times these stations flooded at the same time. How many simultaneous flood events occurred throughout this region? So for example, you see here there were 2. Here you have 6 stations that flooded at the same time. And then here you have 4. Now another component of the CFI is, well, how do you determine the number of stations flooding simultaneously that is actually statistically significant or not occurring by chance? Like, what is the number that is of relevance? So we have the spatial extreme flood event where this threshold lets you know, okay, in this case, 3 or more stations flooding at the same time is what's significant and not occurring by chance. Therefore, in this example, your CFI would be 2, because you have 2 days where you have 3 or more stations flooding simultaneously. In order to calculate the CFI, again, it's a data-driven approach, so you can just pull the streamflow data for all the stations of interest in your region of interest. But first, you need to determine when there was a flood at each station. So the first step is to determine what days there were actually floods for each station and for each day in your time series. Once you determine what days there were floods, you then want to see, okay, how many stations flooded on each of these days throughout your time series. As I mentioned before, once you know how many stations have flooded on each day, you have to determine this threshold, this spatial extreme flood event threshold, to determine how many stations flooding simultaneously is statistically significant or not occurring by chance, so that you can have the possibility of explaining these events or the variability in these events, possibly using climate information. And then your final calculation, the compound flood index, is the number of these simultaneous events you've had per season or annually for your region of interest. Now let's take a closer look at each of these steps. So for the first step, determining when there was a flood. Let's say we have data for a station, station X, and we have the time series here of all the stream flows. But how do we know on which of these days there was a flood? Well, because we're interested in extremes, we went with the 99th percentile. So let's say for this example, that would be 15 CFS. And therefore, anything that had 15 or greater would be assigned a 1, else it would be given a 0, because ultimately we want to count flood days, hence the 1 and 0 designations. Now that we have our 1s and 0s to indicate, okay, there was a flood on this day, there was no flood on these other days, we want to consider all stations and see how many of them had floods on each day throughout the time series. This is how we get our compound flood days. But additionally, as I mentioned previously, we need to determine, well, how many of these stations flooding on each of these days is significant or not occurring by chance, which brings us to the next step for finding that spatial extreme flood event threshold. Now that we have our time series of these simultaneous flood counts, these compound flood days, we determined which days were statistically significant or not occurring by chance by applying binomial PDF. So we ran about 1,000 trials, anything from 0 to 55 stations flooding, and we use a 95% test level. For HUC2, we found that this threshold is 3. Therefore, any days that had 3 or more stations flooding throughout this time series, those were determined to not occur by chance. Now, using this threshold, we're able to determine our CFIs. So based on that 3 or more stations flooding threshold, we found the CFI for HUC 2 to be over 1,900 events in total. So that's over the course of the whole year. But during this peak season, as you see here, these events typically occur between January and May, with a peak in March. And just in that season alone, there were over 1,200 events out of that 1,900 total. Using those CFI totals, we looked at the time series over that 60-year period, and we're able to see that there is some variability here where you have these peaks of occurrence. And yes, while it is showing a slight decrease in the number of these events, the number of CFI events does not directly translate into the amount of area affected, as you'll see in the next slide. Here we have how much drainage area was at risk per year based on these CFI events. And what's interesting to note here that now there's a slight increase in the amount of area that is potentially exposed. But now, when we look at the two time series together, as I mentioned before, yes, you can have CFI events, a large number of these events, and then have a large area potentially exposed, but you can also have a smaller number of these simultaneous events occurring and still have a large area at risk. So just know that the number of CFI events does not translate directly into area exposed, and it can vary greatly. Using our CFI results, we explored some potential forecast models based on using climate information. So we correlated the CFI with some known climate indices. Here you see we included the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and El Nino data, and we wanted to see how well this information could be used to forecast the number of CFI events for upcoming years. For our preliminary forecast, we went with a K-nearest neighbors approach. And as you see, we used 70% of that time series data that we had to train the model to test about 14 to 15 years of the rest of the data from the time series. The goal of the forecast is to meet these two criteria. So we have what we're calling the directionality index and also what we're referring to as the regret score. And I'll illustrate what these two concepts mean on the next slide. So here we have a sample output from our forecast model, where the red boxes represent the observed or the actual number of simultaneous events that occurred. The red line going across is the median value of CFI events based on this sample size, and then the larger boxes are our predictions. So when it comes to directionality, we want to see if we predicted there'd be an above median number of events, is that what actually happened? And in this case, yes, we have the directionality correct. We also want to predict the reverse. So if there are below median number of events, did we predict that? When it comes to the regret score, we want to make sure that our forecast, yes, if it predicts there would be a greater number of events, that's actually what happened, and the reverse. So here we would have no regret. But in this case, we're predicting there'd be a greater number of these CFI events when in actuality there were a below number of median CFI events. And we want to avoid the reverse case as well. So these are some of the things that we're exploring for our forecast to apply to flood risk management. In summary, we were able to observe the relationship between these what seem to be individual flooding events and classify them according to simultaneous flooding events under this compound flood index. And with this compound flood index, CFI, we were able to see that the Northeast experiences a significant number of these events. Additionally, preliminary model runs based off the CFI are showing good results when it comes to directionality. We're now looking to extend the CFI classification across all the HUCs in the US. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments.
Great job, Equisha, and thanks for joining us. Just a quick reminder to our audience, I neglected to mention that as the videos are playing, you are free to submit your questions via Slido. We're #Studio50. And I will be moderating that so I can accumulate all those and ask our presenters during their Q&A. So Equisha, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Great job on your paper, abstract, presentation, the whole cycle, and congratulations on getting this far. That's quite an achievement in itself. I did want to ask you a couple questions as we start the Q&A to let a couple more questions come in. One, was there a certain area that experienced more frequent events or more frequent extreme events than any other area you witnessed?
No, so that was the interesting thing. When we looked at the frequency of these simultaneous events and just how often each of these stations were flooding, it was pretty much scattered throughout the whole region. So there wasn't any specific, area, whereas the northern part of the region had more events versus the southern. It was distributed pretty evenly throughout the region. So yeah.
Okay, great. Again, I'll let you know there are a lot of comments coming in saying great presentation, good work, congratulations. I did have another question. When you're reviewing your gauge data, I noted you define the flood stage or a flood event as exceeding the 99% confidence interval or 99% distribution. Was there any filtering of your gauge data? Did you, for example, are you using all stream records, or did you exclude any stream gauges that had less than 20 years of record? How did you filter your data?
That's a great question. So because the goal is to be able to predict these events with climate information, we wanted to make sure we could go back further than 30 years. So when we looked at the records for unmodified streams, so that's another filter we did. We made sure there were no dams or anything like that. When we went back into the records, out of about 77 stations that they had available for unmodified streams, we went back to 1955 because that allowed us to still keep relatively all the coverage for the whole area. If we went back further than that, then we were starting to lose a lot more stations. So we started off with the 60-year time span.
Great. So just looking at Slido again, if you have any questions for Equisha, please submit them. Again, more great presentation. Suzanne asks, how did you measure simultaneously? Is that the same day? Was it determined by concentration of the watershed?
That is a great question, right? Because is it midnight? Flow that was presented from the data set. But in order to account for maybe persistence, maybe what's going in from the day before into the day after, we did run a sliding window. So we did consider at least a 3-day or 36-hour period to say the same day to account for what could be lingering the day before and the day after. So yeah, that's a great question. So that's how we're initially handling that.
Okay, there's another question submitted that it's kind of related to that. So so is there not significant potential for there to be an influence of storm spatial pattern relative locations of the stations? So in other words, are you treating the stations as independent when they are not?
For effect from storms.
Yeah, so I think the question is relating to potential for a storm to cover multiple stations or to just cover one station.
Right. So because we're trying to gauge if these floods are in fact related to what's going on in the climate, weather conditions, yes, we are considering. That's why we wanted to use the multiple day, I don't want to say multiple days, but because we couldn't just single out one day, all right, are they all flooding on this same day? We accounted for that by considering the day before and the day after, based on whether or not the maximum stream flow was still being exceeded at that time. So yeah, we that's how we're handling that situation too. So you're right, yeah, it is related to the question previous to that.
Okay. And I do have one more question. This is from Elise. Did the USGS have a flood stage established for the gauges you studied? If so, curious how you chose between the 99% threshold versus using the defined flood stage elevation.
Right, so that's a great question. We wanted to go with extremes. So we didn't have to use the 99 percentile, but we wanted to really have some way to say, okay, this is an extreme event relative to what usually happens there. So we did not consider what they had for the stage. But of course, we're considering that and we're, doing comparisons, but because we're interested in extreme, so it may not necessarily have to be such a high flow rate in order for it to be a flood, but we're looking at extreme cases of floods. So that's what we're doing for now.
Great. Well, thanks, Equisha. That's all the questions I've received at the moment. Again, great job. Congratulations on getting to the finals.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining.
Okay, so next we have our next presenter, Miss Vanessa Lee out of UC Berkeley. Vanessa's presentation is Planning for Floods After Fires, Lessons from the 2018 Montecito Debris Flows. So Vanessa, the stage is all yours.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Vanessa Lee, a second-year dual degree student from UC Berkeley, majoring in landscape architecture, environmental planning, and city planning. And today, I want to present to you all our paper on using historical information to inform planning for floods after fires. And our specific site is Montecito, California. This project is part of the environmental planning studio led by Dr. Kondolf, together with other instructors, including Dr. Sarah Limbett, Dr. Radke, and PhD student Sarah Limber. And here you go. These are the 8 of us who work together as Master of Landscape Architecture students for this project. Historical information is not commonly used in the US to make land use planning decisions. And our current approach to manage floods is based on statics maps that do not reflect the complex processes involved in creating a flood disaster. And in Montecito, these processes are more complex with debris flows and debris-laden flows. For example, on January 9th, 2018, intense rains over the burned catchments of Santa Ynez Mountains in Montecito created a deadly debris flow, which led to 23 fatalities, 167 injuries, and more than $1 billion in loss. The debris flow follows a typical wildfire debris flow cycle in Southern California, where the Thomas Fire burned 440 square miles in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. The denuded slopes, together with the change in soil permeability, triggered debris flow to happen during the extreme storm event in January 2018. As you can see here in the model, Montecito is flanked by the steep catchment of San Ynez Mountains, where the Thomas Fire happened. These steep catchment with seasonal flows regularly release debris flows over the past century. The orange area here indicates the 2018 Montecito debris flow that mainly impact the densely populated urban areas in the lower coastal plain near the Pacific Ocean. This is the place where more than 9,000 inhabitants were located. Debris flows in Montecito is a natural process, with at least 6 debris flows and debris-laden floods happened over the past century. While these processes are natural, the key issue here is that people repeatedly build and rebuild structures, especially homes, in these areas that's highly prone to historic debris flows. And this has led to significant property and damages and casualties in the past. And so with this issue in mind, our objective is to understand flood risk as a process by tracking how exposure and information about flood hazard has readily changed through time. And in order to achieve that objective, we divided our methodology into 2 sections. First, to analyze change in FEMA flood maps over time and to create an extended flood hazard areas using a combined hazard approach. And second, we quantified how development has evolved in the extended hazard area over time. And so why don't let's get started? So as the first half of the study, we investigate evolution of flood hazard maps in Montecito. And our key finding here is that these flood hazard areas has readily shrinked over the past 50 years. However, it doesn't mean that the hazard risk has reduced. Another issue here is FEMA utilizes the clear water models based on the riverine flooding approach. And that's different from the typical alluvial fan flooding that repetitively happened in Montecito. These alluvial fan flooding features constant migration of flow paths and as well as channels through a process known as avulsion. And these cannot be robustly represented in the FEMA flood maps that's based on clear water models. And with that in mind, we compiled FEMA flood maps over time and compare it with the actual debris flow that happened in 2018. So now let me walk you through the different FEMA flood maps that we've analyzed. The earliest one, which is also assumably the first flood map for Montecito, was created in 1977 and known as the Flood Hazard Boundary Map by FEMA. And this happened 2 years before Montecito joined the National Flood Insurance Program in 1979. And the second map was made in 1996, and which is also the first flood insurance rate map made by FEMA for Montecito, and includes both the 100-year and 500-year flood zones, even though the change in area is rather minimal. And the second firm was created in 2012. And this is the firm that's effective when the 2018 debris flow happened. And you also notice that how the area, the hazard destination has readily shrinked from 1996 to 2012. For example, where my mouse is here, you notice that how this area that was originally included in the 1996 firm was excluded in the 2012 firm. However, the 2018 debris flow which happened included a much broader footprint than the 2012 firm. However, after the debris flow happened, the 2018 firm remains rather similar to the 2012 firm. That's because that the 28 firm was already in process when the debris flow happened, and therefore it doesn't consider the altered landform by the 2018 debris flow. And so understanding that in efficacy, FEMA created a recovery mapping that represents the widest flood hazard area historically classified for Montecito. And these areas, rather than replacing the 2018 firm, they act as references for the recovering and rebuilding process in Montecito. And you can notice here while the purple boundary represents the 2018 firm special flood hazard area, and the brown area represents the debris flow that happened in 2018. We can see that while many of the debris flow areas are included by the 2018 firm, a lot of the areas that's outside are still part of the debris flow. And therefore, we can understand how the regulatory flood hazard areas are inadequate to fully predict areas that are vulnerable to debris flows in Montecito. And that's partly because these firms are produced based on the clear water floods that doesn't consider alluvial fan flooding, that is the process that's repetitively happened in Montecito. And so with that in mind, we decided to compile all the firm maps together with the flood hazard boundary maps and the debris flow that happened in Montecito together to create the extended flood hazard area that is the broadest footprint of all areas classified as potentially hazardous to debris flow since 1970 to present. And one of the significance of the extended flood hazard area can be represented here. If you look at the 2018 debris flow, the property damage by the 2018 debris flow here, where the red dots indicates buildings that's destroyed, the orange dots indicates buildings that's subject to major damage, and the yellow dots indicate buildings that's subject to minor damage, you notice that a lot of these buildings actually sit outside of the regulatory flood hazard areas, but they're still within the extended flood hazard areas. And therefore, that's the reason why when we're understanding exposure, we're more interested in understanding how exposure changes within the extended flood hazard areas, but not only within the regulatory flood hazard area. And so this shows the aerial perspective of the extended flood hazard area that we compiled. And so then now our question is how exposure has readily changed through time within the extended flood hazard area. And that brings us to the second part of our study, which is understanding the evolution of exposure in flood hazard areas in Montecito. And our key finding here is that even though Montecito joined the National Flood Insurance Program in 1979, the number of structures have continuously increased over the past century, including almost doubling over the past 50 years. Our methodology, including georectifying and digitizing sandboard maps, aerial photographs, and nape imagery to compare structural density and numbers that at different historical moments. And our results indicate that from 1918 to 2016, the density and number of structures has significantly increased through time within the extended flood hazard areas. And especially between 1970 and 2016, the number of structures almost doubled. And you might question that there are areas because in 1918 and 1942, the maps are sourced from sandboard maps, and some of the areas were unable to locate suitable sandboard maps for the specific time period. But you can still see that the density of structure, especially in the lower coastal plain here, has significantly increased from 1918 to 1942, indicating increased home building and other structural building and activities that happened within the extended flood hazard area. One of the key incentives for home building and other activities within the extended flood hazard area is zoning. And so then our question is to ask what is the dominant kind of zoning within the regulatory floodway, the special flood hazard area, and the extended flood hazard area. And it turns out that more than 90% of these land uses are zoned as residential, which are indicated in the color red here in these three maps. And the redder legends, the redder colors represent land uses that's incompatible to flood hazards, while the greener areas, mostly they're inactive land uses such as open space, agriculture, and recreation, they are more compatible to flood hazards. And you can notice that in both of these three different flood hazard boundaries, incompatible land uses, especially residential, dominate. And so our one critical information for us to incentivize reclassification of land use within these areas that's highly prone to flood is to allow the city and public access to repetitive property damages and destructions within the extended flood hazard area. And so we started to gather historical photos and geolocated them in digital maps and describe the specific debris flow that's related to each of the photo. And so through that, we found that a lot of the property damage, as you can see in this map, also the next map here, they are concentrated on specific areas and where the debris flow has repeatedly happened, and buildings, so they were repeatedly built. And so we hope that through creating this tool, we can inform the city to make better land use zoning decisions and to avoid residential zoning in areas that has historically repetitively impacted by debris flow. And to conclude, we want to bring out three key findings. First, the extent of the regulatory flood hazard areas indicated by FEMA has significantly reduced over the past 40 to 50 years. And there are important limitations of using FEMA flood maps that's based on clear water models to project debris flow hazards in Montecito, which are more associated with the alluvial fan flooding process and the sediment transport model. And thirdly, exposure has increased in the extended flood hazard areas of Montecito, both within and outside of the special flood hazard area. And this is not unique to Montecito, but in fact, highly common elsewhere where residential encroachment are often found within regulatory flood zones. And with those key findings in mind, we want to propose two key recommendations. And so the first one is to replace the effective firm maps that's based on clear water models with the post-fire debris flow hazard maps, such as the one that's developed by the California Geological Survey that's based on sediment transfer models and better represent the alluvial fan flooding processes. And secondly, we should reclassify land use in high hazard zones to stop the trend of residential rebuilding in these highly hazardous areas where debris flows has repeatedly happened. And so with those recommendations and key findings in mind, we want to end our presentation by sharing two key take-home messages. The first is that we should understand risk as a process rather than a static element that's frozen in time and space, because risks are constantly changing, both in terms of hazards and in terms of exposure. And we need to understand both the uncertainty and its robustness of change through time in order to improve floodplain management strategies. And last but not least, we've developed the methodology that we've described in this presentation for Montecito. However, it can be used elsewhere, especially in the US, where similar debris flow or flood processes related to constantly changing hazard and exposure can also be found. So with that, I want to thank you all for taking your time to listening to our presentation. And thank you again for inviting us to this great opportunity at the ASFPM conference today. And I look forward to discussing more with you today.
Great, thanks Vanessa, and thanks for joining us. I just want to again reiterate, like I did with Equisha, congratulations on making it to the finals. Your abstract, paper, and presentation were all fantastic. So again, congratulations. We do have a few questions rolling in, and again, just a reminder to everyone in our audience, please submit your questions through Slido, #Studio50. So Vanessa, our first question is, why do you think using historical information to inform floods after fire is valuable to our industry?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. That is a really great question. And that's something that's something that we believe is such a powerful tool for both planners and also for the residents of Montecito and perhaps broadly in the US. Because these historical information, they really show us the repetitive losses that has accumulated at least over the past century, with at least 6 debris flow or debris-laden flows that happen in Montecito. And still, residential zoning are very pervasive in the area. And so we wanted to make a highly interactive and highly accessible tool to hold planners accountable, but also to allow people to readily access and understand the exact locations where these repetitive debris flows has happened. And now we have like RGS, we have ASFPM story map and different kind of interactive tools that really allows us to be able to talk very clearly and be able to visualize very clearly where these places of repetitive impacts happen.
Great. Again, just to pass along, we're getting a lot of comments saying, nice job, congratulations, very well done. So you touched on something in your presentation that it is common in the country. We see a lot of resizing, I'll say, of the special flood hazard area. In your study area, is there any explanation for how or why the flood risk areas on the map are shrinking or being reduced?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. I think there's mostly 2 reasons, but definitely we should. Our next step is basically look into the flood insurance study that was delineated for the firm in 1996, 2012, and 2018 to fully understand the models and the assumptions. But we're definitely sure that the Clearwater models that's based on the riverine flooding paradigm has readily shifted in the past. And the first one, 1977, is probably more based on the historical flood information. For example, it included a flood area of the floods that happened in 1966. And so there seems to be more historical information involved in the earlier flood hazard designation. But probably in the later years that is mostly based on the Clearwater models that's derived from FEMA. But we definitely want to talk, delve into more about that.
So the next question is, those special flood hazard areas are based on existing conditions at the time of the study. Fire created an increased runoff potential and exponentially greater sediment and debris relative to that existing condition. Are you suggesting that all special flood hazard areas be based on a burned condition?
I think so. Firstly, I think the modeling. Before we discuss that, we think that we should be using a more robust sediment transport model than the Clearwater flood model to begin with in defining hazard area. And the second thing that we really want to we are thinking about is to talk about and kind of to rethink about hazard delineation as a process, as a constantly evolving risk because of debris flows constantly changing paths through the avulsion process, rather than just defining a crisp empirical boundary of the special flood hazard area on ground and think everything that's outside are not prone to floods. That's the reason why we want to carry out this analysis is basically to probe into the kind of empirical Clearwater modeling that's in areas where wildfire debris flow cycle often happen, especially in the West Coast.
Very good. Our last question, unless we have any last minute submittals, comes from Warren Campbell. Warren says, the 44 CFRs, the Code of Federal Regulations, define mud flow as a flood hazard. However, they have never been used to Warren's knowledge. Do we need to have an M zone? So that would be a zone that specifically defines a risk from a debris flow.
Yeah, I think that is really important for places like Montecito, and actually like around Santa Barbara, we know that wildfires constantly happened, and they have debris flows that happened in 2018, and then afterwards they have debris flow in 2019. And I think that is absolutely so important, and that's so important that they should be added into their flood hazard overlay zones and planning. As a planning student, I really hope there would be much more consideration about the local hazards, rather than just a uniform, delineation based on the federal policy. But that's
Very
my
good.
thought.
Well, that's great. Those are all the questions, Vanessa. You did it. You made it through. I just want to say congratulations again to Vanessa and Equisha. I wish we were live so we could all give you a round of applause and show our congratulations and our appreciation for submitting and going through this process with us. I also want to say thanks to our 9 judges. Thank you very much for your time, and I know it's time that everybody submitted on their own dime. And a special thanks to Gigi Trebotowski. Very much appreciate your efforts, Gigi. Thank you for keeping us all in line and keeping this thing moving forward. Gonna miss you a lot. So with that, I want to remind the judges to send their scores to Gigi based on the presentations you've watched today. Please do that ASAP. Our presenters will be at the virtual booth, and we'll give the award certificates and reveal the rankings then. And I should also note that there's a meet and greet tomorrow at 3 o'clock. If you don't have the link to that meeting, please email Gigi or myself and we can get that to you. So again, that wraps up our student paper competition for 2021. Again, Equisha and Vanessa, thank you very much. Congratulations on being finalists, and we will talk to you tomorrow. Bye, everybody.